So let me present our wonderful speakers today. Bashshur Abunnasr is an independent scholar based in Beirut, specializing in the history of the modern Middle East with a focus on public history. She is co-principal investigator and the Spencer Foundation-funded project, Disrupting Dispossession, Teaching Palestine in Exile, which documents the experiences of former Palestinian teachers in Lebanon. Her work also includes a book on Beirut's oral histories, collaborations with a Palestinian oral history archive at the American University of Beirut, and with the NGO ProPeace that produced the first bilingual website dedicated to using oral history to navigate contested histories such as Lebanese civil war. Her publications include Ayubi and Ras Beirut in 150 years of photographs, and we are in this together, the Ras Beirut Oral History Project. Bashshur Abunnasr. We have with us also Fanny Julissa García, is an oral historian, a graduate of the Oral History Master of Arts program at Columbia University. She researches and teaches applied oral history methods with focus on immigrant incarceration, family separation, and the transnational impact of failed border policies. She's a director for Separated Stories of Injustice and Solidarity, an oral history project which documents the lived experiences of families separated by the United States government. She served for more than 15 years as a social justice advocate to combat the public health and socio-economic impact of HIV and low-income communities, and works closely with organizations fighting for the end of family detention and supporting survivors of sexual violence. She will begin the 3-year term as a member of the Oral History Association Council in 2025. She's currently the editorial program manager at Voice of Witness. Fanny García. Ngozika Anthonia Obi-Ani is a senior lecturer in the Department of History and International Studies at the University of Nigeria. She's an interdisciplinary historian who explores the connections between women, memory, and conflict. Her exploration of memory and conflict studies gave her a deeper understanding of socio-political dynamics that have shaped contemporary Nigeria. Her doctoral research was based on interviews with Igbo survivors of the Nigeria-Biafra War. She collaborates with the Conflict Continuities Collaboration Research Group at the African Studies Center, University of Leiden, the Netherlands, working on a project, A Question of Memory, the Biafran Struggles in Perspective. She's currently on a research fellowship at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study. Her research focuses on how the transmitted memory of Nigeria-Biafra War is presented on social media by those who didn't experience the war, aiming to challenge the official control of the past. Ngozika. Yes, Natalia Otrishchenko is a sociologist and researcher at the Center of Urban History in Lviv. She has been involved in many international projects, including the Region, Nation and Beyond at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland, and Memories of Vanished Population at Lund University, Sweden. Since March 2022, she has been leading the Ukrainian team in the International Documentation Initiative, 24th of February 2022, 5 a.m., Testimonies from the War. She's the author and editor of the book Conversation with Those Who Ask About War. Her academic interests include qualitative research methods, oral history, urban sociology, and sociology of expertise. Natalia. Gabriele Proglio is an associate professor of modern history at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Polenzo, Italy. From 2014 to 2018, he was based at the European University Institute within the framework of the project Bodies Across Borders, Oral and Visual Memory in Europe and Beyond, headed by Luisa Passerini, where he conducted oral history research on post-colonial diasporas of Somali, Eritrean, and Ethiopian subjectives into Europe, which was then published in the volume The Horn of Africa, Diasporas in Italy, and Oral History. From 2017, he was based at the University of Coimbra, Portugal, where he conducted research on the mobilities and memories of migrant people across the Mediterranean, publishing the book Bucare il confine, Storie della frontiera di Ventimiglia, as well as many articles. Gabriele. And last but not least, Naoko Shimazu is a professor of Tokyo College, International Institute of Advanced Study, University of Tokyo. Formerly, she was research cluster leader of Inter-Asia engagements at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore, and the professor of humanities at Yale College in 2016-2023. She's a global historian of Asia. Together with Gerard McCarthy and Yang, she initiated the oral history project Living with COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, Crisis, Control, and Community, which gathered data from ASEAN countries during 2020-2022 and created an archive of oral history and visual repository of over 100 interviews. Her current major project is on the cultural history of global diplomacy. Now, yesterday we've heard a powerful lecture from Mary Marshall Clark, who reminded us on some of the most urgent and emotional issues in our field. Today I'd love to turn to our amazing oral historians, researchers, activists, and invite them to share Okay, sorry, there are some technical issues, but I hope that they will manage. Okay, the technical issues with the streaming. Okay. So I would like to invite them to share their experiences from the field, out from the field. As you already know from their short bios, each of them had worked with crisis situations. They have spoken with refugees, victims of war, and people who have experienced all kinds of violence, including sexual violence. They have also talked to those affected by the pandemic that, although it feels distant now, we are not forgot about it, changed life for all of us. So today I want to ask them to reflect on what this work has meant to them personally, what it's been like, and what they've learned, and what they stayed with them. At the beginning of this conversation, I'd like to ask how you came to undertake research under such crisis conditions, how you found yourselves in these situations, and what fears you faced. Let's start with pandemic. Naoko, do you remember the moment when you first came up with the project and how you went about implementing it in the pandemic time?
Hello. Hi, good morning. Well, thank you very much, Jakob, for basically inviting me to this panel, giving me this opportunity to share some of the, very briefly about this project that I undertook with my colleagues whilst I was living in Singapore from 2016 to 2023. So how did we start this project? Well, I think if you remember back to the days of COVID-19, I think we all kind of felt this sense of urgency and sense of hopelessness and helplessness about the situation that we had been suddenly put into. And remember all those borders closing, airspaces closing, and we all kind of felt that we were hemmed in to wherever we were in the world at the time. And I think it was that sense that we had to do something in our research institute about this extraordinary experience that we were going through at the time. And that then nobody really knew how long it was going to last. And so it's very much about that sense of the fact that we were living in extraordinary times and that we kind of had to record it somehow. And this is how the project started. And then also we realized that there were local or national level archival projects being undertaken in a couple of Southeast Asian countries. And by Southeast Asian countries, I mean the 10, which were Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And altogether, I think it's about a population of 640 million people. So it's not exactly a small area. And so how are we going to do this? And because as a research institute, Asia Research Institute was particularly good at the Southeast Asian research. And so we felt that we really ought to use the networks that we all had individually and try to establish very quickly national teams in each of the 10 countries. And as luck would have it, when you're in that situation of kind of urgency and emergency, there was this sort of like a collective goodwill and the willingness in all the contacts that we contacted throughout Southeast Asia, mostly through university networks, and again, the snowballing effect that we were counting on to create these teams. So within the space of about 2 to 3 weeks, we actually had national team leaders in each of the 10 countries, and it was up to the national team leader effectively to create, we asked each national team to do about 10 interviews with basically 4 categories of people. And they were the essential workers, and the definition of essential worker depends on the country and the context that one lived in. And then secondly, people who had COVID-19 or had direct contact with people who've had COVID-19 in family situations mostly. And then the minority groups in the particular locale. Because if you think about minorities in Southeast Asia, for example, in most countries, basically the Chinese, overseas Chinese population counts as minorities, except in Singapore, when the Chinese descent is the majoritarian population. So each context has different minorities, and that was something that we found really quite fascinating and instructive. And then the elderly group, because we all knew that the elderly were the ones who were most susceptible to COVID-19, and I think there was the greatest casualty or death in the elderly population. And then in all of these 4 groups, if we could, we kind of asked questions concerning their understanding of what COVID-19 was at the time, and the responses, either them individually responding to COVID or collectively or in the family context, how it went, and then thirdly, questions about state and control. How were their daily routines being constricted by the impositions of the time? And then within the community itself, how did the community respond as a community rather than individual responses? I'm going to stop here because I think I'm fast running out of time. Thank you very much.
Definitely, it forced us to change our habits and forced us to rethink the concept of oral history, doing it at a distance. In this conference, we'll have 2 sessions devoted exclusively to this topic, but usually, normally, in a normal situation, we conduct our interviews face-to-face. And I would like to ask Fanny, how looks like encounters with your marginalized and the population and the people.
Yes, hi everyone. I work with communities that have been impacted by immigration policies that have separated them and frankly caused a lot of trauma. And this has been the focus of my work for a really long time, this project in particular with families that were separated by the US government, but also with immigration from Central America in general because of personal experience. I was born in Honduras. I went to the US as a child with my mother, and I've always been proud of that immigration journey. But I was seeing rhetoric in the news, even to the days in 2008 around the first Obama presidential campaign. And so I really wanted to get involved, and I had done some theater work, which has a lot of storytelling in it, but I wanted to do something more focused, and that's when I started looking at oral history as a form of testimony and witnessing that I wanted to be a part of. And so I work with families now that were separated in 2017 under a policy called zero tolerance, which forcibly took children from their parents at the southern border in the US, Mexico. And I still work with those families, although I'm not currently conducting interviews, but those families are now continuing to experience anxiety. In fact, because I've continued to stay in contact with families, also helping them to apply, for example, for their, under the Biden administration, they were able to be reunited with their children. And in 2024, right before and after the election, there was a mad rush by some of the families that I interviewed to fill out their renewal applications for humanitarian relief that they got under the Biden administration, because they were afraid that they would not be able to renew under the current administration. And there was a lot of conversation about, like, should I even do that? Because if I do renew, then the government's gonna know all of my current information, including all the names of my family, my children, my location. And so it's been a really kind of harrowing experience for families that experience this. For those of you who don't know, under zero tolerance, more than 5,000 families were separated under this policy from all parts of the world. 22 countries were impacted, not just Central American families, although the majority of the people that I've been able to interview are from Guatemala. And many of them identify as indigenous. And so in the process of interviewing them, we realized also that they were the survivors of civil wars in Guatemala. So other forms of state-inflicted violence and experiences. And so participating in the project was a tremendous act of trust and faith, because I was interviewing people while based in New York during the first 2 years of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and I was talking to folks on the phone. So I was calling from New York, they were based in Guatemala, they could not see me, they had irregular Wi-Fi, sometimes they didn't have an iPhone or a smartphone, and so they had to trust that I was not from immigration, that I was not from the government, that I was someone genuinely interested in their story. And I didn't even call it oral history, I just called it conversations, documenting your experience as someone who has experienced immigration. And so now I think families are fearing what does having told their story mean for them under this current political climate in the United States. And not just families, I also got to interview attorneys who provided pro bono legal support to families, and many of them are also scared. For example, one of the law firms that provided extensive pro bono support to help find the families, find the parents and the children and reunite them, recently scrubbed all information about their pro bono work from their website because they're afraid of what the implication is under this current administration. So it's not something that is just like an overly cautious experience. It's that truly families and people active in supporting immigrants in the United States are truly afraid of what does it mean to share your story in this moment. And what I'm seeing is a lot of what I call anticipatory silence. Like they're anticipating that in the future, in the current present and in the future, having told their story or telling their story might come back to hurt their work or the people that they work with. And so what I'm afraid of is like, that we're gonna experience a moment in oral history where the kinds of stories that we see are people who are protected somehow by privilege and their institution that they work for, and we may not get to hear the stories from people who are more vulnerable to being, and who won't be able to fight back in case they are attacked by government agencies or surveillance. Thank you.
And how does the fact that you have your own immigration experiences influence the relationships with your interviewees?
Well, some of you in the audience who I'm close with know that I've taken precautions. For example, this immigration journey that I just told you about, that I've been really proud of, the resilience that me and my mother undertook to go to the US. I've always been proud to talk about it. It's a point of identity for me. But I've taken that information out from my bio, for example. I've also started the process of de-Googling any communication around the Oral History Project about families that were separated, and the website for the Separated Project is now behind a password. And instead of having, one of the advice that I learned early on in my oral history journey was to always save in 3 places: in the cloud, in a hard drive, and on a computer. And now that, Oral History Project only lives in 1 place because the cloud doesn't seem safe, and the process of de-Googling and taking out any information is extensive, and a website that you create is saved in the Internet Archive somewhere, and so it's not always, and something that you put on the internet is never going to be completely private, and so it's a whole process right now.
Thank you. Gabriele, to your interviewees, mainly refugees from Africa and Asia, you were an outsider. How does it influence how did it influence your research?
Yeah, thank you also from my part for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here to share some thoughts and experiences of my research. I collected many interviews, more than 200 interviews on borderlands in the Mediterranean. And I transformed many interviews, many oral memories in books and articles. At a certain point, when I was in Bosnia, on the Bosnian-Croatian border, I realized that something didn't work really well. And it was really easy to understand migration flows, to meet people, to ask an interview, and to obtain an interview. Also to understand how smugglers were working, and also police strategies for pushing back people. The real problem was the violence. How to face the violence, not from my part, but in an historical perspective. How to delve oral memories in a historical narration of that violence. My positionality was totally different from other people met on the field. And even though I share with them good moments, I spent time with them, and I inhabited the same spaces. The problem was that, my problem was, from my subjectivity, was that I had the possibility to get back home. I was free. So the problem was how many words I had to transform those memories in an oral history. Lacan, in my opinion, offers us a really great metaphor, talking about the sliding meaning chain. Certain points said that there is a bottom fixing the signifier and the structure, okay? That bottom was my gaze. I was translating the violence from my point of view, okay? It was an oral history, but was, in my opinion, a Eurocentric oral history. So I get back home from BH, and I started to rethink my approach in oral history. And I started to think to apply the right to opacity theorized by Edouard Glissant if Europe needs transparency for converting, for giving a meaning to everything that is not European. The right to opacity means that there are other geographies, there are other ways of moving, there are other possibilities to signify the world. And this, in my new project, is a practical approach and also a methodological approach in listening other voice to talk about a topic, and also to have the possibility to fail in attributing an interpretation.
Thank you very much. So let's move to Maria. You have been involved in working with Palestinians for many, many years, but you not only co-created the Palestinian Oral History Archive, but also teach young Palestinians to interview elderly people in their communities. Could you share your experiences in your work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jacob, for inviting me and including me on this panel. I think it's so important to have Palestinian voices and experiences represented here. And to be honest, I've mentioned this before, it's slightly overwhelming being the only person presenting a paper on the Palestinian experience at this International Oral History Conference, considering what is going on at the very moment that we're speaking. So it's a heavy weight to carry because, as Gabriele said, sometimes you just don't feel like you have the words, or that the words are not, cannot live up to the emotional impact of what's going on. But yes, I have worked with the Palestinian Oral History Archive at the American University of Beirut, but more recently, in the past 3 years, have been involved in a small research project collecting interviews with retired Palestinian teachers living in Lebanon. And these teachers were former UNRWA teachers, so our project is focused specifically on the years between 1970 and 2000, so 30 years. And in those 30 years, they also experienced the brutality of the Lebanese Civil War as kind of scapegoats in one form or another. So the project focuses on teachers because we felt that in the existing Palestinian Oral History Archive, just to give you a little bit of background of the project, the focus has been on the Nakba experience, the 1948 experience, or on armed resistance, the Palestinian national movements, and not really in the everyday ways that people live through and push back against the repression that they face on a daily basis. And so teachers were really important, or they kind of embodied that kind of everyday experience. And we also felt that they were very underrepresented and underestimated in their contributions for the Palestinian struggle for justice. in their everyday classrooms, you know, imparting a sense of being Palestinian to their students, while at the same time being shackled by the Lebanese state, which required them to teach the Lebanese curriculum. In other words, they could not teach their own history to their students. So this served as a constant reminder of their own vulnerability and their statelessness. So in terms of the field experience, we did, our small team included research assistants, Palestinians, who were the children and grandchildren of Palestinian teachers, because although I'm Lebanese and my partner is Palestinian, we felt that given the vulnerability of our narrators, we wanted to ensure that they knew or knew of the people that were asking them questions, because this would, you know, build trust and a sense of safety for them. So that was very central to our project and training and mentoring these younger Palestinians in their 20s. And also it resulted in these wonderful intergenerational conversations between retired teachers in their 70s and their 80s, sharing their life stories with these 20-something-year-olds. So this was really, you know, a wonderful outcome of the project, as well as the fact that the research assistants in their own right became oral historians. But just also, it was also different for me because I was not actually conducting the interviews. I listened to them. And that was, you know, it was wonderful to listen to, but it was also kind of frustrating because you feel like you're not, you feel like you're in the room, but you're not really, you're disembodied. But it was, you know, it totally engrossed me in the sense that in the beginning, the conversations were a bit stiff and formal, you know, in the Arabic language, which sometimes was, narratives were spoken in classical Arabic, which is very formal and also indicative of the educated nature of the teacher. But then, you know, they loosened up over time, and there was this dynamic between the narrator and the interviewer, which was quite, you know, was quite inspiring in, for example, just the eloquence of some of the narrators, because again, as teachers, they were used to standing up and presenting themselves and articulating and having a stand. So that was something that, you know, was very interesting, as well as the tenderness with which they responded to the interviewers' questions. You know, there was really a sense of, again, that intergenerationality, and the matter-of-fact way they related, you know, near-death experiences as, you know, part of their 9-to-5 experience. So these were just, you know, some of the observations that we found, and yeah, I mean, and this was all going on. Of course, we started in 2022 when Lebanon was still just coming out of the uprisings of 2019, the COVID pandemic, and of course the Beirut port blast in 2020. So by 2022, things were, you know, there's a sense of fragile stability. But, you know, and that's when we conducted the first round of our interviews, of 30 interviews. And then by 23, October 23, of course, the whole ground shifted, and, you know, the war on Gaza spilled directly into Lebanon, turning the south into a, you know, a live, active combat zone. And that was where many of our narrators were from, our researchers were from. So we had to suspend interviews for several months. We stayed in touch with each other. And 24, we started again tentatively. We had a workshop in the summer of 24, but there was always this fear that things are going to get worse, and they eventually did by September 24, actually a year ago to this day, which is very, you know, I mean, it's just the pace, the acceleration of events was, you know, and crises was overwhelming. Yeah, I mean, the neighborhoods in Beirut were leveled to the ground. Israeli ground forces had invaded the south. And of course, thousands and thousands of people, Lebanese, but also Palestinians and Syrian refugees in Lebanon, were displaced and killed. So that's kind of the setting we tried to continue in, and we always touched base and wondered whether we should stop or we should stop. But, you know, both the narrators and the research assistants were ready and willing to pick it up again once things settle down. And 25, beginning of this year, we did continue. We did wrap up some interviews. And now we're just kind of in a bit of a waiting phase. But yeah.
Maria, do you think that in a current situation when Palestinians are paying the highest price to be heard, finally heard, this oral history work has a new meaning?
Well, oral history, as Edward Said has said, gives us permission to narrate, but really the Palestinian culture has always narrated its story. I mean, from the 1948 Nakba, this was their way of keeping their culture and their community alive. And this continues until this very moment. You know, in Gaza, stories are being documented as genocide is being committed, as Gaza is being annihilated right before our eyes. So I don't think it's, I guess, these stories have always been so important for Palestinians. So I think oral history kind of complements that, but at the same time, there is an element of frustration, of course, because they don't really need permission to tell their stories. What they need is for their stories to be heard, and to be heard enough so that there can be some form of justice and you know, and peace and stability for them. I mean, in these decades and decades of statelessness. But yes, it is important. It is very important to collect these stories, especially as the Nakba generation is disappearing. And the younger generations do collect the stories of the Nakba, but it's also because of so many different factors. The politicization of Palestinians is already a problem. So kind of being Palestinian itself is dangerous, right? So it's hard to also, you know, in a way there's a protective element of one generation to another, not to let the younger generation become too Palestinian, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think but this is turning also. I feel like now we're in a different moment where things are turning around again. So, yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Natalia, you record Ukrainians, but unlike Maria, you are from the affected nation by the Russian aggression. I would like to ask you how is possible to conduct oral history research in an ongoing conflict in the conflict zone? Thank you.
Yeah. I have come from the country where the Russian war of aggression is still ongoing and every day claims the lives of both civilians and military. The Ukrainian border is just 250 kilometers from here and just 3 hours of driving. And these references to distance, both in time and space, are not occasional. We use distance and proximity as inherent for our thinking about oral history. The events that we are discussing with the witnesses are always temporal and spatially embedded. And we hope that the distance in time and sometimes in space can provide us with more objective vision, shield from disturbing emotions, and protect from any unexpected consequences. But recalling is always relational. It's about us here and now in the present and us in the past, either a day ago or decades ago. And one of the assumptions that is implicit in our discipline is that we can have a safe present to speak about the difficult past. Our experience in Ukraine challenges this assumption. We are constantly threatened. More territories are being occupied and devastated by the proximity of the front line, and drones and missiles explode all over the country. How can we still practice oral history under such conditions? For me, recording stories with witnesses inside the war means a very nuanced discussion on the safety. Both narrators, their families, people mentioned in the testimonies, and people who record and later assess those stories. We are social creatures, and our stories always embedded the stories of others. They also reflect a very time-sensitive values and assumptions, which can easily change under the new political conditions. Therefore, in our documentation work, we rely on longitudinal and participatory approaches. when we constantly adjust to crisis situation and create spaces where, together with the research participants, we can think about the interview situation itself and the life of the testimonies after they have been recorded. Informed consent is one of the venues where we can negotiate this variation of disclosure strategies, and I'm stressing here the variation. But this communication goes beyond simply signing up the document. It is an ongoing process with no expiration date. It's about long-lasting responsibilities in communication and mediation that scholars and their institutions have to take. I have to think constantly about the consequences of my work, imagine various futures, and especially be sensitive to the violence on a different nature and performed by different actors that my work might cause. The obvious source of violence is the Russian state, which can use information from publicly available testimonies against civilians and under occupation or Ukrainian soldiers. Therefore, it might be an issue of life and death. But the violence can occur on the level of community, where the accusation of someone's collaboration can result in social exclusion or persecution. At the same time, the perpetrators wanted our silence. Sharing stories is an act of courage and trust. It can be a tool of power and a gesture of solidarity. Navigating between the paternalistic approach to safety and empowerment through sharing is one of the main challenges in my work. However, my deepest fear, and we are talking about fears and hopes during the session, is of a different nature. I'm convinced that oral history is possible only in a democratic society where we can trust others and where we can rely on inclusive and non-repressive institutions. Globally, I see how democratic spaces are shrinking, and we lack agoras where honest and often difficult discussions can occur. Gayatri Spivak once said that who shall speak is less crucial than who will listen. And I am afraid that no one will listen to the stories we record now, either in Ukraine or elsewhere. So now I see the maximum of oral history not only in collecting and preserving voices, but also in creating and maintaining communities that will engage with those voices. For that, in our specific case, first and foremost, we need the Ukrainian community to survive.
And Natalia, how do you cope with this double burden to make interviews in Ukraine?
I think
being a Ukrainian researcher.
I think that the burden is not double, it's multiple. Okay. Different parts of our layered selves are affected differently during the war and the situations of violence and crisis. I am a female researcher, and I can travel freely. I can sit here and talk to you, unlike my male colleagues who are restricted in their travel abilities. As an interviewer, I listen to stories that give me hope, but also are full of suffering and loss. As a daughter, I am responsible for my mother. As a colleague and friend, I am worried for my dear people who now served at the front line or nearby. As a Ukrainian citizen who lived in Ukraine during the war, I experienced drone and missile attacks, sleep deprivation, anxiety, and fears about the future. Also, the war affects not only my current self, but also my possible selves in the future. And I think it's another dimension that we have to think about, not only depriving here and now, but also what kind of future we are now losing, we will not have ever. So how can I cope? I carve spaces for action where I can still reclaim my future. I act as if I still have some control over my life. I plan even though everything can be ruined. And I dream even though politicians in faraway countries can easily destroy my dreams. And finally, I invest time and skills in designing projects which enable those different futures. And I care for others and let others care for me.
Thank you, Natalia. As you can imagine, most of interviewees of Natalia and other members of the team are female interviewees, naturally, yeah. But I would like to move to our another speaker, Ngozika. Your interview is also mostly women, especially women who experience sexual violence. Could you tell us more, elaborate more, how it's possible to talk about sexual violence in the frame of the oral history interview?
Thank you, Jacob. You know, I'm coming from the perspective of the Nigeria-Biafra War, which actually I'm a second generation victim of the war. I didn't experience the war, but I was born 10 years after the war. I never heard about the Nigerian Biafra War while growing up. Not my parents telling me the stories, nor from school, because history actually was removed from the curriculum during the period and after the Civil War, until just recently. So I studied history in the university, but the curriculum of the history department did not capture the Nigerian Biafra War. What it glosses over it, we study the colonization of Nigeria, and then the next thing is that you will see the next curriculum will be Nigeria since 1970. And yet, it's just glossed over. But when Nigeria, after the war, was under military regime for a very long time, and by 1999, President Obasanjo became the civilian president. It was there that I started hearing more about the Civil War. Because my parents it's only when they want to put specific dates on things, you hear Ogaya, Mbaya, but there is no further story about it. But they discuss among themselves. So it was this that actually, when 99, when I started seeing people protesting, especially celebrating May 30th, that I started asking questions. I didn't do much until when I traveled from Ngozika to Enugu. Ngozika is where the University of Nigeria. And I saw young people with placards, with flags of Rising Sun, with red and green, black flag. And then after that, we saw police, the army, the security, killing most of them in some communities. So the Nigeria-Biafra War was fought from 1967 to 1970 between Nigeria, the federal government, and the Igbo ethnic group, which is currently at 22 million people. So this war, though it ended in 1970, but the war is still resonating up to today. When I did my PhD work, I had to interview. I wanted to understand what were people's experiences during the war. And I first started with the victims. So I interviewed those who experienced the war. And it was there that I met people that suffered sexual violence. Though they suffered sexual violence. But the story was kind of scarce. Because I came from an ethnic group where sexual violence is not... sexual violence is kind of... is abnormal, is something that is prohibited, is something that the women are blamed, is something that the victim became a laughingstock. Their families are stigmatized, and they were never married. I will use one woman as an example. I named her Madam Nwaka Omaya. The first time we approached her to discuss with her, she was very aggressive. Yes, have you heard about it? Are you here to do what? You want to hear the story? No? But, that kind of aggression. But for me, I had to also make her to understand that I'm not here to actually, but I wanted to understand how people passed through that period, because the war lasted for 30 months. And why I'm so much affected when I do this research is because my community is a border community. So when the Nigerian army invaded, that community was the first place. And for that, the Nigerian armies were there for the 30 months of the Civil War. So they suffered much. That experiences is what I wanted to understand. And understanding the experiences of the victims made me to also understand how the younger generation are interpreting and acting on the memories, which some of them we are getting through social media as a result of the Facebook, Twitter, the rest of them, they are getting, which are, for me, are fragmented stories, not actually what should be heard, because the Nigerian government censored that story of the Civil War. So my research now is just to understand how women actually navigated that period of violence. And again, some of them preferred not to talk. And for me, with my years of research, I've learned to also understand, because as a researcher or oral historian, you don't just listen to what people talk, but sometimes the body language says a lot. So from that, their body language, I was able to understand when it's time for me to listen. I don't prompt, I allowed the victim to talk. And like Madam Mwaka, it's not that she's now seeking justice. She's old, she never married. The community stigmatized her like most of people that suffered sexual violence. Because in my community, when women, there is like women body is a lot of responsibilities is bequeathed on a woman, in the sense that if a woman, you commit adultery, there are certain things it claims that the ancestors inflict you. So when such a thing happened, especially in the war instance, you find out that many people are not really, they don't want to talk about it. So I will tell you that one thing I face is scarcity of information, because of the stigma involved that you are raped by the Nigerian soldiers or you were raped by the Biafran soldiers, the stigma. So Madam Mwaka actually ended up telling her own story, which nobody wanted to hear. Everybody, the neighboring communities, the communities were interested that Madam Mwaka, she had an affair with the Nigerian soldier, she was raped, and the family never accepted her back, and the community never accepted her. Rather, her story keeps moving from one community to the other. And in this process, it made her more aggressive to people and to researchers.
And how do you cope with such situation as a researcher? Do you have any strategies to care for yourself in such circumstances?
I've been researching on Biafra War since 2015, and I've not stopped. And my research is moving from the victims to the generation. But at every point, I am traumatized. Last August, I was researching also, because there is a kind of, since these new agitations in Southeast Nigeria is not safe. It has never been safe for me to carry out the research, because the Nigerian government proscribed the indigenous people of Biafra. So is regarded as a terrorist organization. And on the other hand, those agitating Biafra also see you as a potential saboteur if you are not talking what they want to hear. So I am in a precarious position. The last time I went for field work before I traveled, I was so scared for my life. I remain, in that I'm just powerless kind of. And the thing there is that even after the interview, I find it difficult to transcribe, because during transcription, you also find yourself being re-traumatized again. So these are the kind of thing I experience. It's not easy anymore, especially when the new generation are agitating, carrying arms, because they are now armed. They are carrying arms. My fear is remembering people who suffered sexual violence. Now, these new non-state actors are also forcefully taking young girls, which happened during the war. This is no longer the issue between the Nigerian army and the Igbo ethnic group. But now, the non-state actors are now raping young girls. So each time they talk about war, or when I teach about it, when I say it among my students, my mind will always go back to the experiences of those women, having one-on-one interactions with people who were violated during the war. And I begin to think, this is the crisis. When Nigeria removed this story from the curriculum, they don't know this story. They've not interviewed. They are based on maybe what they got from internet or what maybe they got from anywhere. In this process, they are acting, not remembering that women will be raped, not remembering that women will be forced into marriages. They don't remember it. And now, like one of my research assistants, each time she travels to her village today, she had to disguise. As an old woman, she wear boo-boo gown. She can't wear jeans and sneakers because immediately they will take you into their camp and you live with them. They call them wives of the unknown gunmen. They live with them for a week or 2 weeks, and the next thing they bring them out of the village. And the next thing the family will do is to take them before, because they wanted to protect it. Because people who suffer rape or sexual violence is still stigmatized up to today, no matter the circumstances among my ethnic group.
Thank you, Ngozika. Actually, you touched the topic I would like to take now for next few minutes. We were talking a lot about field work, but I think it's also important to focus on work with data you've collected, yeah, and how you manage with transcribing, disseminating later on the data. Trying to balance, you know, the expectations and responsibilities towards your interviewees and their safety and your safety as well. Could you more elaborate about this? And this is the question to all of you. And yeah, who would you like to start?
This is an ongoing conversation that I have with Doug Boyd. The rise of AI and these platforms and services that on the one hand allow us to do work much faster, quicker. Transcription, for example, is one of those. However, for projects with people who have experienced state-inflicted violence, the privacy concerns around uploading audio onto an AI software that then will transcribe is really heavy and really present. And so that's something that I'm really concerned about and trying to figure out what is the safest AI software out there for this kind of work that will allow us to transcribe much faster and more affordably. But for the separated project, we had the benefit of working with students at Barnard College who were eager and enthusiastic to listen to the stories and transcribe them for us, so that allow us to get through approximately 45 interviews with families and interviews with attorneys and advocates who helped reunite families, and also with human rights workers in Central America who had to do the work of finding, detective work basically, of finding parents that have been sent back home, deported back to their homes, and trying to reconnect them with their children who had remained in the US.
Okay, Jack. So in my own case, I'm fortunate that my spouse is also a historian. So it's always better when you have someone or you have a colleague that went to the field with you. Because if you are alone, it's just you and the violence in the same room. So as you said, if there's a software that one can use and do this to also reduce the trauma of you being the researcher in the field, it will also help in analyzing the data. Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So in our research, or our group, we had problems with languages, mainly because we really tried to interview people in the language that they were most comfortable with. And sometimes they're very, very sort of isolated languages. And all our transcripts, we have about 140 transcripts from these 10 different countries, and they have all been translated into English so that anybody who has access to English can use them. And so we often actually had discussions about how to deal with not only just transcribing it, but translating it into English.
Before I spoke about the right to opacity, and also from this perspective, I try to rethink my methodology in transcriptions. I asked two women living in a city, not scholars, belonging to the 9 main communities, diasporic communities, to collect 10 interviews with other women about food and about memory. And I asked them to conduct the interview in their proper language, mother tongue language, and then to transcribe the oral sources into Italian. Why this? Because there were some terms, but in general some meanings that are not, that is not possible to translate. We call nostalgia something, but for instance, in Arabic, there's hurba or xidin for Egypt, or other terms that are not exactly the same, are other things with other geographies. This is an application of the right to the opacity, to the approach in oral history, also giving the possibility to oral memories and to the intersubjective exchange to create other meanings.
Sometimes I have a feeling that the more data means less people. And that's why I always try to maintain connection between the real human beings who shared their stories with us and all of the solutions that come next. Because you always have to have this connection. In my work, I always prioritize interviewers and their wishes and their visions and try to adjust technical solutions to this vision, despite the fact that sometimes institutional architectures are very inflexible and digital solutions are also removing the right of people somehow to their own testimonies. That's why for me it's crucial to have this community and to do as much as possible closer to the community and closer to the experiences of people who are in focus.
Thank you so much. So the last question from me. What does crisis-related oral history mean to people you talk to? And can oral history really change anything in their lives and in your lives?
Well, I think just to end on a note of hope in a very hopeless time, I think perhaps, I'm sure one of the most hopeful outcomes of our project was on one of our RAs, Hamad, who's in his late 20s. He kind of just took our breath away by saying, you know, he learned more in this project, the first 2 years of this project, than he'd learned his entire life about Palestine. You know, he describes himself as part of the depoliticized generation. Like most Palestinian students, he never learned the history. You know, he heard about the Nakba, of course, but from the Nakba forward, he did not know the history of the rise of the Palestinian national movement. So, you know, in his words, he said, through these interviews, I was learning more than I was interviewing. Narrator by narrator, interview by interview, the timeline started building momentum and everything started to make sense. The pieces of the past began to fall into place and changed my life, such that he shifted to pursuing an MA to research the gap that his generation represents and the reasons for their rupture with the past. Yeah, with the hope of opening possible futures. So yeah, I think listening and narrating don't necessarily bring immediate change, but they matter for how this history is carried forward, for how people remember the events that have happened. And I take great stock in the title of Omar Akkad's book, latest book, Al-Akkad, which is one day everyone will have always been against this. So I find that very heartening as a way forward, perhaps.
Well, while conducting interviews inside the war, we learned about incredible acts of solidarity and support, but also the darkest parts of human nature. And Joseph Conrad, a Polish-British author, in his novel The Heart of Darkness, while being critical about European colonial rule, also reflects a lot about the power and violence. And through the stories of ours, we're always exposed to different types of horrors. But also we travel to the heart of darkness simply by living in the country affected by the war and constantly learning about the violence happening under occupation and also with people who are still in the captivity. We do remember them and we do hope that they will be back home. And our responsibilities as interviewers and like citizens is to cope with that on the daily basis and being mentally prepared to receive testimonies and navigate these emotional landscapes. And I'm convinced that oral history projects of crisis, they need psychological supervision, constant supervision on individual and collective level as well. And in our group meetings, it served not only as a coping strategy for us, but also as important space for methodological and ethical reflections that help us to attune our collective values to a certain common denominator. And I believe in academia we are desperately lacking these informal spaces for exchange and share. We need more of these spaces to create them and also protect them. And Joseph Conrad's novel inspired Coppola's film Apocalypse Now. And I think it's also a very bright metaphor of our current dark times. And how can we find hope inside the apocalypse? It's a big question that I'm constantly asking myself. I believe that real hope is born from despair. It animates other possible futures and also highlights what is really meaningful to us as social beings. The pandemic taught us how priceless it is to share the same space with others, to hug, to kiss, and also the war once again reminded us about the value of human life and dignity. Oral history, I believe, is more important than ever because it reminds us about this importance of being in the genuine presence with another human being and also being really interested in another human being against all of the encapsulating fear and pain that we are living through and against all of the forces that try to keep us separate. We still have to stay together and create communities, and I hope that these communities will be inclusive enough and remain sustainable.
Right. Well, can I just say, as a historian, because I don't normally operate as an oral historian, so it's been a great pleasure and an incredibly steep learning curve for me to be amongst oral historians. And I just think what oral historians do is absolutely important in terms of understanding the past. Because I study about people who were around 100 years ago, and I look at conscript diaries, you know, war diaries, that sort of materials. And if only oral history had existed then, I would have much more in-depth insight into people's experiences, mentalities, attitudes towards death, and so on. So I think it's not oral historians. Obviously, you know, we're here talking oral history amongst oral historians. But I think for historians at a broader level and society as a broader level, I think what oral history does is actually to give voice to the people who may not otherwise have the voice.
I've had the opportunity to witness a wide range of choice and motive for participating in oral history projects as part of this project with families that were separated, from the act of not participating as a form of self-preservation and survival, which we need to acknowledge and not judge, but also to folks who decided to use a pseudonym in order to be able to tell their story freely, and folks who decided to be completely anonymous, while still others expressed very explicitly in their interview, my name is Maria, my name is Jose, my name is Juan, and I want this story to be remembered as my story. And so I think that that is really powerful in these times. And so even though there's a lot of fear, there is a lot of choice happening, and I really want to honor that. And even for me, I'm speaking here today and it's being live streamed, and I'm talking about all of the situations that I've experienced with narrators in my own personal journey as well. But there are certain key words that I'm not saying, right? Because it might get picked up on the internet. And so there's, again, a whole variety of choice that's happening, and I'm really honored to be witnessing that in this moment.
Thank you so much. I think that now we have time for questions from the audience. So we have like another, I'd say 15, 20 minutes if you don't mind. So let's do the short Q&A session.
So my question to Natalia would be, so the question that you had from the moderator was whether it is okay to do oral history in the time of conflict. As a survivor of the genocide from Bosnia, somebody who did over 700 interviews about Srebrenica genocide, I think it is very important to do it right away, to capture the memories as soon as possible. There's nothing to lose. There's much to gain, but you will lose everything if you don't preserve the stories. You don't know what will happen to that person, whether that person will survive, whether she or he will be ever able to share. Sooner you do it, more details you have. What happens later is that the publicly constructed narrative impacts the individual survival, the individual memory, and filling the gaps in the memory. Then later interview is, how can I put this in English? Less original than if you do it right away, you know. So my question is whether you have constructed a methodology, the protocols in interviewing the survivors of the war in Ukraine. Can I ask another question to, I'm sorry, to Ngozika Anthonia? Sorry if I have mistaken the pronunciation of your name. In Bosnia, over 30,000 of women were raped during the war. As I said, I did 700 interviews. We never dared to interview women raped during the war in the sexual violence. I don't think that in my country there is an oral history project which preserves any stories of women raped during the war. And as you know, thanks to activism of Angelina Jolie, United Nations established the rape during the war as the war crime, you know. And my question is, during the interviewing, so did you consult therapists and other social workers and other experts when dealing with such a sensitive topic? That's my question. Thank you to both.
Thank you for your words, and thank you for the work that you are doing in Bosnia, because it's also very important work that helps us to preserve the memory of the genocide. So my words of appreciation first. And I will double once again the the powerful quote from Mary Marshall Clark, so it's never too soon, never too late. We will have just different stories which might be more fragmented and more elaborated in terms of details, closer to the event itself, and more structured narratives later. In our project that I'm co-leading, the testimonies from the war, from the very beginning we designed it as a longitudinal, and we have several meetings with the same person. During the first meeting we asked them, is it okay to recontact them? And most of them agreed, even not all of them. And we managed to find around 1/3 from the original sample, even though I'm hesitating using the word sample in this case, and re-interview them. Not asking the same question, but trying to have the continuation of the story. But still people are recalling the first events of the full-scale invasion, and therefore we can compare different types of memories that we receive like few weeks after February 24th, 2022, and later a few years after this event. So therefore, through this project and through this documentation, it is possible to trace how different official narratives somehow interfere in the way how people remember certain things. But as I mentioned, it's all about relational stuff. And you are in the present in a very certain setting, in a very certain political conditions, and therefore people self-censor themselves. People are choosing the words and vocabulary how to describe their experiences all the time, and often unconsciously. And therefore, we will just have different types of stories. But at the same time, just to echo what you said, I interviewed my colleagues also for the book that Jakub mentioned, the conversation with those who ask about the war. Unfortunately, it's now only in Ukrainian, but we are working on English translation as well. So it was a very common sentiment among my colleagues who also did similar documentary work in Ukraine, that we wish we can do more. But at the same time, we are also very limited in our human capacities. We wish we can do more, we wish we can record more, but at the same time, the day have only 24 hours. And that's why we still have to make choices about what to prioritize and trying to do our best in order to preserve those stories. So thank you again for your comment. And as for the protocols, we do develop them together in our international team, and I'm working together with my colleagues. Anna Veligala yesterday provided a workshop on the methodology of this emergency interviewing. And we also published a bit of that, so it is available. Our general practices in ethics and methodology, it is available in Rocznik Historii Mówionej. I think it's there, but also online, so it's possible to see what kind of practices we build our work on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. In my own case, the Nigerian Biafra War ended in 1970. And because of the taboo surrounding the discussion of sexual violence, it was very difficult. I mentioned that getting information, there is scarcity of information. But this particular woman is just like when you have a piece of paper, you climb a tower and then you spread it so the thing will. So when you interview another community, her name keeps cropping up, and I take one of our students to visit her, and you saw the reaction. She was very antagonistic. But in her own case, it's not about justice, because the war was, at that point of interview, the war was almost like 50 years old. It's about hearing her own side of the story, outside what what has been circulated. Because this particular woman I'm talking about, most of them, they use their name to compose songs after the war. So it was, that was the why I see her from that point of aggression. Or are you here to confirm? So in most cases, because it has been very long ago before, and that's why I've argued in one of my papers that Nigeria urgently need an oral history archive where marginalized voices should be documented. But this is lacking. And then even when you go to the museum, like Umaya War Museum, you find out that the way those the things are displayed there is tilted towards the federal side. So most of the Biafran regalia, what happened, we are not represented in the museum. It was just about the federal government. So that's the thing there. So there's no therapies for them within the period. But the problem, my own major problem, is the young girls who are taken to the camp of non-state actors now that they are, well, one of the villages, I needed a DSS to go there. You need protection. But when you go with the anything symbolizing the federal government, the villagers will not trust you. Going into that place with DSS, with police, doesn't make sense at all. So what I did was that I used one of my students who is from the same community, and then we used her to get information. But the parents of those young girls will immediately take them outside the village. There's no way you see them. They will remove them from the scene entirely. So I think talking to them will take more years. Yesterday night, when I left here, I just heard in the news that the commander of the non-state actor has been arrested by the police today. So I'm just following the happenings to see, will there be any change in what is going on in Southeast Nigeria today with the arrest of this commander and the killing of his own second in command. I heard that the second in command was killed in the raid. But remember that the person who is at the top of it all has been in prison since 2021. He was arrested in Kenya. So it's not about those that experienced but my problem now are people who are experiencing the same, the young girls who are taken into the camps and then being there and then used the way they want today. That's my major problem, which for now I will tell you, I don't have access to them because their families are protecting them.
Thank you. Just as in Nigeria, the civil war isn't in the curriculum for education, in Lebanon, 15 years of civil war is also not taught. And one of the reasons is because the people who were in power during that bloody period are still in power, or their sons or grandsons are. And so they couldn't agree on how to present the civil war, so they decided simply not to address it, which means that the stories of the Civil War, the politics and the people, is ultimately inherited through stories, through families, which I think can entrench division, identity-based division. So my question is for Maria, how do you think oral histories, and it's been practiced more and more in Lebanon and across the Arabic-speaking region in recent years, but how do you think that can remedy the lack of community-based and official history?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Reem, especially, as you said, because there's basically an imposed historical amnesia on Lebanon. But that's actually something we've been working on in terms of using oral history to approach the Civil War, and using oral history in a way that, oral history was fundamentally meant, from the grassroots, from capturing people's stories through their own communities, and to, it's still very much a work in progress, but we're emphasizing the multi-perspectivity and the everyday realities of the war that people experienced, and trying to integrate those. We've done a few projects trying to integrate those stories into classrooms. I mean, we've been doing this now since 2018. I know I'm kind of all over the place here, but 2018 we worked with public school teachers in their social studies and Arabic curriculums and trained them, and we'll be talking about this more in the next session actually, trained them on using oral histories in their using oral history methodology in their classroom with their students. So then the students go to their communities, their families, and collect stories on the war, and then bring them back to the classroom so you get multiple perspectives. So it's very, very small scale at this point, but this is something that we see oral history as being a really a great entry point into tackling this issue of the narrative from above. There isn't even really a narrative from above. There's more of a don't talk about the war. So this is one way that we're hoping that oral history can make a difference in educational settings and beyond, in podcasts and things like that. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for all this wonderful debate and the contributions you presented about documenting. I think this, what I got out is documenting in a situation of crisis or in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. That's was really fascinating. But the question that arose from me, especially from what Fanny and Ngozika said, is what's the future of the research? What's the future of the collections? And I have to remember that oral history suffered a massive loss with the closing of Memorial Moscow. Yeah? Irina Shebakova, a longtime member of IOHA, went into exile. Selma Leidersdorf has published a short article about the little resonance that the loss of this archive found in the international oral history community. So what to do with collections that are in danger to be confiscated, destroyed? What about collections that, as Fanny said, are perhaps a danger for the people interviewed? Yeah? What is in Nigeria if governments are restricting research, if they introduce laws that forbid certain topics? So what's the future of such collections? What are strategies to secure your research and the interviews?
I'm not sure if I have a definitive answer because, like you said, many of the oral histories that we're a part of are part of a history that is constantly shifting. And so when I started this work, I started thinking of oral history as documenting stories of the recent past or the past, and now I'm in this position where I'm documenting things that are impacted day by day almost by politics, by governmental policies, and so I feel like there's no definitive answer other than doing what I can to protect and keep the stories private for some time. And I'll give you one example. I'm also part of an archiving team that is working with an immigration organization in the United States that collected government documents through FOIA requests. This is the way that you can retrieve government documents in a very democratic way in the US. And we came together as an archive to find out where we could archive these documents, and the oral histories that I've conducted were going to become part of that archive as well of documents. And so we talked to several different organizations, nonprofits, law firms, but also law schools. And the archiving team, we wanted it to go to a nonprofit because we felt that there would be more care given to the oral histories and these documents. Ultimately, the organization that hired us decided to go with a law school that has a history of working with the US, and so government. And so at that point, I decided not to include the oral histories with that archive. And so this means that documents are in one place, oral histories will have to be in another place, and in fact, we may have to keep these private for the next 10, 20 years, we don't know. So it's very much, I think, an answer that is in flux and constantly shifting, and all we can do is kind of really protect what we have collected so far.
Thank you. In my own case, it's still similar to what she just answered. And in Enugu, which was the capital of Biafra during the war, there is a center now called the Center for Memory. So this center is where some of the stories are being kind of archived, but it's not like it's supported by the government. So it's just personal funding and personal visitors visiting there, because Umuahia War Museum is not actually representing what happened between the two combatants. So for me, many people, second generation, third generation of Biafra War survivors are just carrying out the research on a personal basis. I don't have answer to where my own is. As a historian, I'm feeling that it's just my duty to get this, document some of these experiences. And as I said earlier, I'm also looking at how their generation is acting on this. And because the Southeast is currently under siege of insecurity because of the non-state actors, their activities. So my research work is looking at the cost of memory. When actually people started hearing about Biafran War, how the younger generation are acting on it. And on the other side, they are also devastating the zone. Many companies are leaving the zone. People are being kidnapped, people are being killed on a daily basis. And again, some of these, when you listen to some of these leaders of agitators, you find out that some of them are threatening those they felt as saboteurs are not supporting them. And in most cases, they are only aligned to the kind of, let me use the word, underdogs, those who are the lowest social strata. They have this radical imagination of that Biafra will be an Eldorado because of the policies, certain policies that have been in existence since the end of the war, where they felt they are being still marginalized. And since the end of the war, nobody from Igbo ethnic group has been the president of Nigeria. Each time there is a new election, the war narrative will emerge from nowhere. People will start saying, these are they are the people that caused the war. They should be held responsible. And in this process, the other ethnic groups don't even trust them to be the leader of Nigeria. And the younger generation who did not experience the war are not comfortable that they've not been able to produce the president. They are not economically, infrastructurally. The federal presence is not in the Southeast. And so what do they want? They want this kind of a Biafra, an Eldorado, where everything will be fair, where there will be equality, where there will be no marginalization, which is actually far from the reality. But because of their own marginalized testimonies or whatever they inherited, they are not looking at in fact, I see it, they don't understand the meaning of the actual war because they've not experienced war. And they didn't live under what circumstances to understand better.
Thank you so much. Let's thank our fantastic guests here. And I think that we also, let's honor our interviews, because without them, we could even act or exist as oral historians. So let's honor them, our guests and our interviewees, with a great applause. Yeah.